So we have been meditating for some time, and we have experienced that when we meditate, the mind seems to settle down and we find some peace, and then without any reason we start to feel happy inside, and that's a nice feeling. And natural tendency is that it would be good if this nice feeling could continue sometime, and if possible, if it continues for all the time, that will be the best. But if this peace is experienced only if we stop all activity, if we sit down, if we close the eyes, and only then during meditation, if we are feeling that quietness, that silence, then it is not possible to make it permanent, because we cannot keep sitting with eyes closed for 24 hours. So the only way in which this silence can be permanent is if it could coexist with activity. Even when we are walking, talking, doing other things, if that bliss, that silence, that peace could be maintained, only then it can become permanent. So one way of expressing is that we want to become an expert in meditation. Now, how do we define an expert? Like when a person is, let's say, learning to drive a car or ride a bicycle. So in the beginning, it needs all the attention in the driving. If someone starts talking to the person who is driving, then he may get disturbed and make a mistake. But once a person becomes an expert, then how the pedals are moving, how the steering is moving, that is so automatic that it does not require any attention from his side, and he can put all his attention in speaking and talking. So this analogy can be carried to meditation also. As long as we are not an expert meditator, we have to stop all other activity, we have to sit down, we have to close the eyes, and only then we feel that silence, that peace, that bliss. But once we become an expert, if it could be possible to become an expert, then a situation can come when that maintaining of that silence, of that peace, that bliss does not require any attention from our side. It's obviously present all the time, and we can do whatever we want. We can open the eyes, we can start walking, start talking, and that peace is maintained. Now, this will be a situation when the person is an expert meditator. So how do you make a non-expert into an expert? Again, using the analogy of person learning to drive, in the beginning you don't disturb him because he has yet to feel confident that he can drive at least. But after some time, then you can start disturbing him deliberately. Like once he has learned how to drive without any disturbance, then you sit next to him and start asking him some questions. In the beginning, very simple questions like what is 2 plus 2? Maybe he can easily answer that. Maybe he gets slightly disturbed, but then he can come back to driving and make it. And then you do it again and again. Some simple questions like what is your name and things like that, which he can easily answer. So in the beginning he would get slightly disturbed and then he comes back. But with practice, he will be able to answer these simple questions without getting disturbed at all. And then you can increase the complexity of the questions. And then more mental activity is needed in order to answer these questions, and then he again starts to get disturbed, and after some time he gets used to it, and then he is not even disturbed by these slightly more complicated questions also. So this is an example how we can make a non-expert into an expert. We slowly increase the level of disturbance and let him practice enough so that he is not disturbed at all with that level of disturbance, and then increase. So that is what we do in meditation also. For first 100 meditations or so, we allow the person to meditate and let him sit in a quiet place, close the eyes and get away from all disturbances and let him meditate. And once he has had enough experience of doing that, then we start something which is called Siddhis. Now Siddhis comes from the word in Sanskrit Siddha. Siddha means an expert. And Siddhi means expertise, the quality of an expert. So now we want to make a meditator into a Siddha meditator, that means an expert meditator. So what we do is, in meditation we use a mantra, and the quality of the mantra is that the sound of the mantra is important, but the meaning is not important. There is no meaning of the mantra, because meaning is something which will start the thinking process. We'll start thinking about the meaning. And we want the mind to become more rested, so we don't want to engage the mind. And the sound has another quality, that when we start a sound and leave it, automatically it becomes fainter and fainter. So when there is no meaning, mind has nothing to work on, and the sound is there which becomes fainter and fainter. So the effort required to think something loudly is more compared to effort required to think something faintly. So the effort starts to become less and less. In other words, we can say rest starts to become more and more. So this is a technique by which we get to a level of rest which is more than twice as deep as in the deepest part of sleep. So this is meditation. But once we have done it for a long time, then we use a sutra instead of a mantra. Now sutra is something which has opposite qualities to a mantra. In mantra, the sound is important, meaning is not important. In a sutra, it is the meaning that is important and sound is not important. So when there is a meaning and sound is not important, so you can use some words which are in the language of the person who is practicing it, in the mother tongue. So these are some simple ideas, some simple words which have a meaning. So after we meditate for about 20 minutes, then for 20 minutes we meditate with the mantra. So we come to that silence level, if not exactly transcendence, but somewhere close to that. And then we start using the sutras. So when we think of that word which has a meaning, the mind will naturally start thinking about the meaning. And thinking about the meaning is a mental activity. So the mind will come out of that silence a little bit. It will get disturbed. That flat surface of the mind, like a flat surface of a pond of water, get disturbed. Some waves get created. So when we think of the word, then it comes out of that silence, but then we let it go again. So let the mind transcend through the sutra now, instead of transcending through the mantra as in meditation. Now, this sutra is a word in our own language. It has a meaning and it has a sound. Now, sound is something which has a quantity. You can have a louder sound, you can have a softer sound, still softer sound. But meaning is something which doesn't have any quantity. It's just a quality. Like I can say flower, flower, flower. So the sound has different quantities, but the meaning still remains the same. So when this activity starts to settle down, when we allow it to settle down, what is happening is the sound value is becoming less and less. And since meaning has no quantity, the meaning still remains the same. We can imagine a last situation when the sound has become so less that ultimately it comes to zero. But since meaning was not decreasing all along, the meaning still remains the same. So one can think of a situation when the meaning is there without the sound. So what was disturbing the silence of transcendence? It was the sound value which was disturbing. So that disturbance is no longer there, and we can think of the meaning without shaking that peace, that silence of transcendental consciousness. Now this in the beginning seems very difficult to understand, because how can we have activity of thinking and silence at the same time? So we can use some analogies to explain that. Like when you have a flat surface of water in a pond, that is an analogy for transcendental level. When the mind is completely rested, the body is completely rested, but we are awake, we are not sleeping. So that is restful alertness. Now this pond of water can be, the situation can be changed in two ways. One is that wind starts blowing or someone starts shaking this water and waves are created. That is one way of changing the situation. But there is another way of changing the situation also, and that is that imagine this flat surface of the pond is there and a cloud comes in the sky. So when the cloud comes in the sky, instead of that blue sky being reflected on the water, now a white cloud is being reflected. So the appearance of that flat surface of water changes in some way. So there is a change. The situation has changed, but the surface of the water has not been disturbed. So this is as close an analogy that we can think of the situation when the transcendental consciousness, that peace, that silence of meditation is not disturbed, but still a meaning gets infused into it. Like that flat surface or the pure consciousness, the peace has acquired a color to it. It has not been shaken, it has not been disturbed, but it has acquired a color. Now that would be a way in which we can entertain a thought, quote unquote thought, I would say. Not the earlier kind of thought which would have shaken the water, but a faint feeling which is not shaking the peace of transcendence, but still it changes the appearance of the transcendence. And this happens only after we have got used to. In the beginning, of course, we take the sound in order to think that word. When we think of the word, the sound and the meaning both come. But with practice, when we allow this to settle down, we learn how to think, we can say, again, because this thinking is different from normal thinking which has a disturbing effect. But we can have a situation when that meaning is also coming in our transcendental consciousness and the transcendental consciousness is not getting disturbed. So that is a situation in which we have some activity, very faint mental activity, but in such a way that it is not disturbing the peace or that silence. And then we increase that level of activity and we get used to doing that increased level of mental activity again without getting disturbed at all, maintaining that perfect peace and still having some way of entertaining some thought. And that keeps on increasing stage by stage. And in the beginning, these mental activities we get accustomed to, and in the final stage comes when the body also starts jumping up and down. This is the last stage of Siddhis, which is normally called yogic flying. And one realizes that it is possible that even when the body is doing hectic activity, the heartbeat increases, the breath increases, but in the mind, at the deepest level of the mind, the silence is still maintained. In fact, not only maintained, it becomes even deeper silence than in transcendental meditation. And this can be experimentally tested also. Like the silence that we feel in transcendental meditation, that has a physiological correlate. That silence and that bliss is measured by EEG, electroencephalogram, and normally we put electrodes on different parts of the brain, and for a person who is a non-meditator, these waves coming from different parts of the brain are different. But while practicing meditation, if the same experiment is done, particularly this specific type of meditation, transcendental meditation or Vedic meditation also we call it. So if that practice of meditation is correct, then all the different kinds of waves coming from different parts of the brain become synchronous. They become coherent. The whole brain starts to function as one integrated unit. So this is an example of how the activity can be there in the brain, but that activity is so synchronized that we feel peace and silence. Now this activity of the coherence of the different waves from the brain is much more during yogic flying. When the body is hectically active, the mind is much more deeply peaceful than in meditation also. And the other effect of that is that now that we have learned that it is possible to be bodily active, it is possible to be mentally active and still maintain that peace and that silence and that bliss, then with practice we can start doing any other activity that we do in the world, and always we remain free from the effect of that activity. Normally what happens when we are active, our silence gets disturbed. But with that situation, we can be hectically active outside and that silence is not disturbed. So that means we become free from the effect of activity. That is why in spiritual circles there is a word liberation. Right now we are bound in the sense that if the world outside is chaotic, then it has its effect on us also. We also get disturbed. But when we become liberated from the effects of the world, whatever is being done outside by others, including by my own body and by my own mind, all that activity is not able to disturb my peace, disturb my silence. So that is liberation. This state is also called cosmic consciousness. So transcendental meditation is a technique specifically designed to take our awareness from waking state of consciousness to transcendental consciousness. And Siddhis is a technique specifically designed to take our awareness from transcendental consciousness to cosmic consciousness. That is the next level of consciousness. So there are 7 states of consciousness. We can, in some other video, we'll talk about that also. But non-meditators experience only 3 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming and sleeping. Once we start to practice transcendental meditation or Vedic meditation, then we also know that there is another state of consciousness which is neither waking nor sleeping nor dreaming. It's completely different qualitatively from all these 3 states, which is transcendental consciousness. So our experience increases from 3 states of consciousness to 4 states of consciousness. And then when we start practicing Siddhis, then we come to a stage when we experience a 5th state of consciousness, which is transcendental, which is cosmic consciousness, which is coexistence of transcendental consciousness with the other 3 states. That means we are simultaneously experiencing 2 states of consciousness. That means deepest level of the mind, we are experiencing transcendental consciousness, absolute peace, absolute silence, absolute bliss, and the mind and the body are experiencing waking state of consciousness, because waking state of consciousness is characterized by activity. Either our mind is functioning or the body is functioning, that is waking state of consciousness. So one can say that we can become wider. Earlier we were a thin sliver of consciousness. We could either be active or be silent, but not both at the same time. And now our consciousness becomes expanded like a pond of water, which is simultaneously active on the surface and silent at the bottom. So if our awareness is small, either we are on the surface or we are at the bottom. Either we are experiencing activity or experiencing silence. So we have a choice. But once our awareness expands to cover the whole depth of the pond, then we can experience both perfect silence and full activity at the same time. And that is a state from which it is not possible to fall back into the earlier stages. Then one is completely free for all time to come. Once, this is also called enlightenment. That means from now on, no new stresses can be formed. One thing is that previous stresses are all removed. Only then we experience cosmic consciousness. But the other effect is that it makes us immune from further stresses. And once liberated, a person is liberated forever. One effect of that is that we become independent of the effect of activity outside. The other effect is that since we have become independent, we can undertake more hectic activity, take more responsibilities, be more active, because we are not afraid of that activity any longer being able to disturb my peace. So we can take bigger challenges, and we are able to affect the world much more, and the world is not able to affect us. So that is the technique of Siddhis.